Welcome to Journeys of Belonging to Blackness. When it comes to understanding what is Blackness, we must acknowledge there is a paradox, a juxtaposition between Blackness and white supremacy. We see this in the way that, on the one hand, colonization and white supremacy is a process of negating Blackness. And then on the other hand, in the exaltation of Blackness as a process of resistance and resilience through Black existence. I spoke with Professor Ted Landsmark, who's captured in this iconic photo, to reflect on the imposition of Blackness.
In the United States, it certainly almost always is associated with a history involving slavery, migration, often associated with poverty. It is associated with a kind of a special set of cultural contributions to the country, particularly in terms of music and style and presence within a larger white culture. Blackness, to me, always infers an identification with a very proud tradition of struggle against a number of oppressive political and cultural forces that have largely dominated America from its inception. I think that being Black means that one has a special status, a distinctive status within American culture, is largely epitomized by research of W.E.B. Du Bois, who pointed out that Black people in America have a double consciousness. We are both of ourselves and sometimes outside of ourselves as we have to negotiate the various statuses and oppressions that we face within the large white American culture.
White supremacist structures are imbued with anti-Black racism that depersonalizes African-descended people by transforming them into commodities or things. Yes, we can all agree that capitalism is an economic system, but we should also understand that it is reliant on organizing and distributing power in terms of who owns, who produces, and who are the commodities. This leads to the significance of why racial hierarchies and racial schema exists and how we arrive at the imposition of racism and racist history of enslavement in the creation and constitution of Blackness itself. Frantz Fanon once observed that Blackness is historically constructed and based on a social signified system of devaluation, where there's an association with the person's skin color, ancestry, as well as a host of other immutable characteristics. And based on these characteristics, they're granted a set of privileges and legal rights. The schema, or the mental shortcuts that people use to organize information about who is Black and who isn't, are the same mental shortcuts people use to guide their cognitive processes and behaviors. And these mental shortcuts are reflective of the centuries of racist history, whereby people have assigned certain assumptions and placed particular values to physical features in a structure of hierarchy. Now, the structure of hierarchy, as Isabel Wilkerson discusses in her book Caste, is an important way to understand how humans can assign certain inherited physical characteristics to specific abilities and groups in order to form categories, place social, cultural, and economic value to these categories, and then place them within a schema of superior versus inferior. And so recently I spoke with Javier Wallace, who is a PhD candidate from the University of Texas at Austin, about Blackness and the construct of Blackness. And here's what he said.
My name is Javier Wallace, a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm also the founder of Black Austin Tours and the co-founder of Afro-Latino Travel and Blackpackers, race to be a social construct. But I definitely understand this social construct to have very large material consequences for those of us who are racialized, particularly those of us who are racialized as Black. Do understand the way that it's been constructed, that there's very few ways for people that are attached to Blackness, whether willingly accept blackness or who blackness is ascribed to them can escape the consequences of this social construct. So for me, blackness, as it pertains to myself and larger speaking, are people who in some way have attached themselves to the construct of race originating Black out of Africa, the continent of Africa, and how it has lent itself to the exploitation of African people that Europeans started to call Black, to perform in slave labor and be exploited around the globe, but particularly here in the Americas. So I define Blackness having a connection to that and understanding that it was a concept created to describe my ancestors and then to place them into a caste system.
And this is what leads to Blackness as a race concept within a caste schematic of racial inferiority. It is where Blackness becomes associated with being of African descent, and then in a white supremacist structure deemed as inferior.
I'm Fadeke Castor, and I'm a cultural anthropologist who studies decolonization in the African diaspora world with a focus on the intersections of religion, race, and politics. If you ask me to define race as a scholar, as an academic, I'm going to have to say that I am not in the business of defining race, that white supremacy is in the business of defining race. The white supremacy is in the business of policing whiteness and the other. That race is really a white supremacist project.
When examining the imposition of Blackness, of course, we must contend with what Dr. Fadeke Castor says and refers to as the white supremacy project. Colonizers of the past and present still have an unwillingness to admit how they fully adopted and integrated its imperialist European racial schema within all the systems of structure. In doing so, they created structures to selfishly serve themselves and their governments, as they were determined to systematically annihilate, displace, enslave, and disenfranchise the various indigenous and African people they encountered, not only just in the past, but even what we see today. Signaling their self-reverence and compulsion to categorize, the racial schema employed relied on enforcing the hierarchy that placed European descendants at the top, amassing majority power relations. All the other human groups are then placed in descending order based on their assigned social and human value and proximity from European descendants. The imposition of Blackness as set up by the racial schema and hierarchy becomes justified as divine will, the rule of law as found in religious texts, or as a sum of natural scientific assumptions presented as fact that gets reinforced throughout the culture over time and that still exists today.
Hi, my name is Ron Sullivan. I'm a professor at the Harvard Law School, where I teach in the areas of criminal law and criminal procedure and legal ethics. And I write in those areas, including race theory. At Harvard, I serve as faculty director of the Criminal Justice Institute and the Harvard Trial Advocacy Workshop. Race is contingent. I agree with that assertion, but to say race is contingent doesn't mean it's not real. When I say race is contingent, it means that it doesn't exist metaphysically. You can't go into the world and grab race and pull it out and sit it on a table. It exists along a continuum. So when I think about race, you can think of it on a biological level as loosely a group of people who share in the frequency of certain biogenetic traits. Now, obviously, that exists on a continuum, and you can't sort of ossify that thing and say, these people are one race and these people are another for all times and in all contexts. So depending on where I am, I could be raced a number of different things, but very loosely, people sharing the frequency of certain biogenetic traits, you can make loose markers along that line. That's certainly one definition of race. Another definition of race at the other end of the spectrum is an ascriptive definition of race. And that is, to put it loosely, W. Du Bois said, if you're forced to sit in the back of the bus in 1948 in Louisiana, you're Black. That's an ascriptive definition of race. That's how people see you and how people experience you in a particular time and in a particular culture. And that's really largely notwithstanding how you see yourself. And so those are probably two ends of the pole, and somewhere in the middle is this notion of race as groups of people who share a certain history and cultural experience. So think here, James Baldwin, what he refers to as Negro, people who are the sons and daughters of Jim and Jane Crow in America. There's a certain lived history and a certain experience that binds folks, and that's also a way to think about race. And there are those who construe race as heritable characteristics, and that's when we get into very dangerous things. So all of the sorts of negative stereotypes about Blackness, laziness, incivility, unattractiveness. Somewhere in the 17th century, people began to think that those sorts of traits were heritable through bloodlines, and that became definitory of race. And that's the most malicious, dangerous sort of definition of race, that these sorts of negative traits are heritable.
The idea of race as a set of heritable traits forms the basis of the pseudoscience called eugenics, which argued that people could be divided up into various racial groupings according to their genetic ancestral descent, and were predisposed to be either superior or inferior by nature and in culture. These scientists use their scientific racism to justify these groupings according to the persisting racial hierarchy, which also led to propagate untrue, negative stereotypes and tropes about African descendants that also coincided with the political and social mood of the time. The influence of eugenics spread rapidly, not only throughout Europe, but also here in the United States. Centuries of the imposed ascription of what Blackness is and its relegation to a specific caste position in the racial hierarchy has informed the ways African descendants themselves internalize, think, and talk about while rejecting and redefining Blackness for themselves.
We are expected to act, or a lot of times is used in the context of how we are observing someone's actions. I was in Prague, and I met this young lady on the street, white girl, and her expectation of me, and a similar thing happened while I was in Iceland. But when I meet people there, their expectation of who I'm supposed to be is completely different than what I am. Like their expectation was someone who either participated in or was extremely familiar with gang activity or drug activity. People wondering if I knew certain rappers and why I don't wear chains around my neck. And I'm like,
the reality that we feel that you need to carry with you in terms of how your ethnicity and race, even though we know race is constructed, but how that is perceived by others, and sort of coming home and deconstructing experiences throughout the day or news of the day. And I think that's how we most often talk about Blackness in our home.
Sometimes when people talk about Blackness, it hasn't been necessarily a positive thing. Just the other day when I was going to, with a friend, And he was commenting that this place that you were going to the gym. He said, when it first opened, it was really nice, but you know what happens when our folk get involved. And I think of Blackness, I tend to think of the positive things, how we are, we strive to be the best we can. I've always was raised to say that you always do your best, and that you may have to try twice as hard to get half as much as some of the white people, but still hang in there and do that.
Mm-hmm. I think that especially in the last couple of years, or especially in the last decade, we've tried to turn Blackness into something that is phenomenal. Like, we think of beauty, we think of magic, we think of mattering in the world, we think of asserting ourselves, and we think of making sure that we are here, and that we are proud, and that we are still making strides. And so we've come up with certain phrases to try to make it kind of a mantra, and a self-affirming mantras. Black Lives Matter, Black Girls Magic, Black Girl Magic. And I think those are the kinds of things that we are intentionally trying to do in order to make sure that the definition of Blackness brings about something that is positive and affirming, rather than what has been imposed and on us, which is negative and oppressing.
The imposition of Blackness based on the racial schema and the racial hierarchy has led to both the spoken and unspoken social responsibility African descendants have toward subverting or rejecting these tropes and meanings by focusing on amplifying Black history both locally and globally, building community, as well as asserting pride in the face of persistent pathologizing. Focusing and emphasizing the reclamation on Blackness as something positive are acts of joy and rebellion.